Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching the Wire Wrap. I'm Shravasti Dasgupta. This week, Vice President Jagdeep Dhankhar has made some very stinging remarks against the judiciary, calling it a super parliament and referring to Article 142, which gives special powers to the Supreme Court, as a nuclear missile against democratic forces. Now, these comments come in the backdrop of the Supreme Court delivering a very landmark judgment in the case of Tamil Nadu, where it has ruled that governors cannot sit on bills, as was the case in Tamil Nadu and the DMK government over there, and it has set timelines for presidents and governors to act on these bills that are sent to them for their assent. And this also comes in the backdrop of the Waqf Amendment bill being before the Supreme Court, which is continuing to hear petitions challenging the constitutionality of the new legislation, which has remained very contentious. Also this week, we have seen that the Enforcement Directorate has filed a charge sheet against Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi, and the BJP has accused the Congress of money laundering, and the Congress has called it a political vendetta. So to discuss all this and more, I am being joined by Seema Chishti. She is editor at The Wire, and Sanjay Hegde. He's a senior advocate in the Supreme Court. Thank you so much for joining us. First, let's get started with the Vice President's remarks, which is really everywhere in the media at the moment. Yesterday, that was on Thursday, Mr. Dhankhar, while speaking to the 6th batch of the Rajya Sabha interns, made some really stinging remarks, as we were referring to earlier, and he called Article 142 of the Constitution a nuclear missile which is being used against democratic forces. He went all out against the judiciary, against this particular bench of judges that delivered the judgment in the Tamil Nadu governor case, and said that judges have become like a super parliament who have no accountability, and what authority do judges and the judiciary have to issue directions to the President of India. So I want to come to you, Sanjay, that these remarks made by the Vice President, constitutionally, how correct are his remarks that the president cannot be issued directions to? What he said exactly is that what is the basis, and your job is only to interpret constitutionality, and you cannot basically calling the judiciary as a super parliament because of this particular order, which has, for the first time, as we were saying, set timelines for governors and presidents to give their assent to bills. So is the Vice President right in saying that the judiciary does not have the right to give such orders and issue, as he says, directions to the President?
Well, the last time I checked, we were a constitutional republic. And once you are a constitutional republic, you operate according to the Constitution. If the Constitution, upon interpretation, says thou shalt do, then that does not mean that whoever is told that thou shalt do can sit on his hands and say, I will not do. So if you are going to go down that route, then whom does the Constitution give the job of enforcing whatever is stated there? The court, which interprets it, also has to execute the orders. So what was the situation before the Supreme Court? That the governor deliberately was sitting on bills. When the bills were represented to him, he then sent it off to the president. Delay. An unelected governor, if he stalls the will of the people of that state, then what is to be done? The Supreme Court said, yes, whether you're the governor or the president, ultimately you're the constitutional head of the state, and you have to work in accordance with the Constitution. You can't work according to your likes and dislikes. So yes, you are supposed to do it in a reasonable time. What is a reasonable time? We think 3 months is reasonable. And if you do not do it, then the affected party, that is the state concerned, can come to us. If you have a doubt also, please come to us. We will resolve the doubt. But you just do not have the option of doing nothing. I don't see that there's anything in what the Supreme Court has said to which the Vice President can take umbrage. The Vice President must remember that be you ever so high, the law is above you. And in this case, The Supreme Court has laid down the law. You may like it, you may not like it, but you have to follow it.
I think we should also look at his comments in the backdrop of the fact that Dhankar himself was governor of West Bengal, a tenure which was marked by, one could call it infamy in the sense because of his prolonged confrontation with the TMC government. And in a sense, he was one of the first governors in the Modi years that continued to, clash with the elected government. And then we have seen that template kind of spread to different parts of the country as well, whether it's in Maharashtra, Punjab, and elsewhere. So the fact that he's taken particular exception to this is not surprising.
So, yeah, I mean, the whole context, I mean, apart from, of course, things that Sanjay has very eloquently kind of laid out, what else is a democracy if several institutions do not contend and contest on meaning, on substance, and in delivering people, citizens who elect their government, a reasonable democracy? What else are we for that? But I think the government, I must say, has been spoilt over the past several years in having its key issues, particularly Hindutva issues, or very key issues apart from maybe the electoral bond matter, to not finding any check or balance. The parliament, of which, and Mr. Dhankar is the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, behaves like a government spokesman on many occasions. His choice of words, the fact that he'll tell Rajya Sabha interns all this, just look at the positioning of what he said. This is not the first time he said it. He's been going on. He invoked Yashwant Verma, which he was completely out of line for the chairman of Rajya Sabha. He's the second most kind of on the order of protocol in India. He's next after the President of India. So he, that ignominious chapter continues in many splendors even in his tenure here. He expelled MPs, suspended MPs rather, from the Rajya Sabha at the beginning of the year just before the elections. So I think this entire, why his remarks are coming is also a sense of feeling very, very much on the back foot. And I think the government is feeling hemmed in because whether it is Ram Mandir, whether it is Kashmir, on serious issues which matter a lot to this government, they've completely been tick-marked by the courts. This is one issue, the governor issue and the Waqf issue, where the courts have got up and asked questions and disrupted the complete hegemony of the agenda, of the narrative that this government enjoys. So I think that is what is causing so much concern. And you're seeing the vice president say all kinds of strange things like super parliament and all that. I think he kind of stands to reveal himself and what he's kind of tasked to do. And the backsliding of India's democracy, which means the legislature, instead of holding the executive to account, if he's going to be lawyer for the government, then that puts the citizen of India, it gravely imperils our democracy. So it's quite concerning to see him emerge and erupt like that.
I think also interesting is the fact that, as you were just mentioning, that the government itself has not really spoken on this order, that on the Tamil Nadu case, but they have, in a sense. I mean, is Dhankar acting on his own when he's speaking like this, or it's a deliberate move? What do you guys think on that? That is a deliberate move for the government to have the vice president speak on behalf of the president, who's been a governor himself, while the government itself does not say anything, and we are hearing that a review petition might be filed in the case.
So the AG and all have spoken, they have said things, and we hear the government's law officers in court have argued, so we broadly know what the government is saying. But even after electoral bonds, this government says nothing. Whether it's Manipur also, the Prime Minister doesn't speak. So for them, on bad news, they don't speak. But there's a very serious kind of a coincidence of statements that Mr. Dhankar makes and what seem to be things that the government spokesman make, or rather the party spokesman say. So even if the cabinet spokesman doesn't say that, the party has been saying that, and from what their followers say on social media, there's a great kind of you can correlate and see that there's great similarity in the messaging.
Also, it's interesting that Dhankar's comments come just weeks after, during the parliament session, during the budget session, he went back to the question of the NJAC again and again. He used the Yashwant Verma issue, where allegedly a pile of cash was found at Justice Yashwant Verma's house, who's since then, of course, been sent back to the Allahabad High Court, and a Supreme Court committee is looking into that. But Dhankar made a reference to that yesterday as well. But in the budget session, he used that issue to say that NJAC, which was passed by Parliament, was deemed to be unconstitutional. And how could the Supreme Court do that? That when a law has been passed by Parliament, does the court have the power to deem it unconstitutional? So once again, he gets into the question of all of that. But in Parliament, he's also spoken very fondly and highly of the Supreme Court's judgments in the Ayodhya case or in Jammu and Kashmir. So what must one make of these statements? And the fact that he uses the Parliament to make these very definitive statements.
There he is actually breaching the constitutional provision that you cannot discuss a judge's conduct in parliament except when you have an impeachment motion. Otherwise, the two authorities, the constitutional authorities, operate in their separate spheres. Now, precisely because he is the vice president and he's been a lawyer and a senior advocate at that, one would have expected him to have observed all these conventions and these requirements of the constitution, but he is the battering ram of choice. I often think that he is possibly auditioning for a bigger role. Many years ago, when I think it was Vice President Zakir Hussain then, who had Mr. Inder Kumar Gujral, then Mrs. Gandhi's minister, coming over when there had to be a change in the presidency. He told him that अगर आप सोचते हो कि इसी छोटे घर में रहूंगा तो मैं उतना कमजोर नहीं हूं, पर अगर आप ये सोचते हो मुझे बड़े घर दोगे तो मैं उसे ठुकराने इतना बुलंद भी नहीं. So it is like that.
The big house exerts a lot of
the draw of the big house, and if destiny and luck suit him well, maybe he goes there. But in the meanwhile, you cannot demolish institutions in your climb. That is where I draw exception, particularly with the conduct of a senior advocate who owes so much to the profession.
I also want to make a point here. This whole business about parliament being supreme, as if that is the only expression of a democracy. The constitution is very clear on that. Democracy is not a majoritarian sentiment. There is the house of the people. There is another house which is meant to exercise its wisdom in order to act as a check on a momentary kind of a exercise of power, which is the Rajya Sabha. Then there is the judiciary, there is the media, there is lateral accountability, there is diagonal accountability, and all of these together make the democracy. So to constantly make the case, which is the BJP seems to be making that ever since they've acquired a majority in parliament, which is not the case when they didn't have a majority in parliament. We know what happened during the Bofors agitation and all. When parliament was abandoned, there was a ruckus even between 2004 and 2013. That was the case. So you cannot kind of shift and change your stance on institutions when you have so much power. And also to realize that power is transient, and democracy is not only about parliament. Democracy is as much about judges, about the average citizen, as it is about people sitting in the Lok Sabha. To just keep chanting democracy as if democracy, i.e., is only parliament and only something that happens there, which laws will be made by parliament, sure, but they'll be tested against the spirit of the constitution. That remains the larger kind of principle under which Lok Sabha and everything stands and contends.
But I think what you've just mentioned, Seema, is at the heart of this whole confrontation, that what is the role of the parliament and what is the role of the judiciary? If the judiciary does in fact act on bills that are acts that are passed by parliament and strikes them down, then it's seen as a challenge to parliament. But is it really a challenge to parliament? Because the constitution has this inbuilt mechanism that if a legislation is not satisfying the question of constitutionality, that is the role of judges. So this argument that is coming up again and again, even in, for instance, the Waqf bill, Act, where Sanjay, you're arguing, so we are not going to go very much into that. But the fact that the government is saying that it has been passed by parliament, so it cannot be not implemented. As for instance, in West Bengal, Mamata Banerjee has said that it's not going to be implemented. But the question is that it's land and states, these are state subjects in the concurrent list. So this again puts it in the Supreme Court's court, in the sense that if the Supreme Court holds it to be unconstitutional, the government will have no option. So another confrontation building up over there, because the government is very keen to have this law implemented.
Well, governments are always invested politically in the laws that they make. And every time I hear these governments saying that, this is the will of the people as expressed through parliament, I keep thinking, look, you have a majority for the moment. Yeah. What is that majority for? It is for working a constitutional democracy. Ultimately, it is the constitution that prevails. And what is the constitution? It is a set of norms which we've all agreed on, that this is the country that we will build, these are the institutions, and that they will not get into each other's territories. But if a, if one institution goes beyond its bounds, the other institution will put a check on it. You have a parliamentary majority, but supposing you were to use that majority to make a law that only people with green hair can become prime minister. Fine, law passed by parliament. You think courts can't get into that? No. Any law that parliament makes is subject to judicial review. Judicial review is again not to the wisdom of your law, but it is, do you have the power to pass it? Did you pass it in the correct manner? And have you, by that law, infringed anybody's fundamental rights? These are the broad parameters of judicial review. Now, you can't say, just because I, parliament, have said so, no son of a judge can bring it down. That's the real problem. There's a judgment which came out yesterday from the Fourth Circuit in the United States. And it's put this problem brilliantly. The Supreme Court 9-0 which is a very rare thing in the US, told President Trump that the man that you deported, you bring him back. Do everything. And the administration is dragging its feet. It doesn't like the judgment. So the district judge, as well as now the federal circuit, which is roughly equal to a high court, have said, no, you shall do it. And there, Justice Wilkinson, who was a Reagan appointee, a judge for 40 years, says, now the branches come too close to grinding irrevocably against one another in a conflict that promises to diminish both. This is a losing proposition all around. The judiciary will lose much from the constant intimations of its illegitimacy, to which, by dint of custom and detachment, we can only sparingly reply. The executive will lose much from a public perception of its lawlessness and all of its attendant contagions. The executive may succeed for a time in weakening the courts, but over time, history will script the tragic gap between what was and all that may have been, and the law in time will sign its epitaph. That is the reason you run a government of laws and not of men. The laws have to be in conformity with the greater law that everybody's agreed to, that is the Constitution.
So, coming back to this confrontation between the government and the judiciary, in a sense, we also saw Dhankar's comments in the backdrop of what happened in court during the hearing on the Waqf Act. I'm sorry again. So, during that hearing, we saw some very sharp comments from the Chief Justice Sanjeev Khanna in response to what SG Tushar Mehta said about whether the bench itself can hear this case or not. So, do you see Dhankar's comments also coming as a reaction to that, what is happening in court on this is the second issue in quick succession where the government is, in a sense, being kind of reined in by the judiciary? These strong comments by Dhankar, a kind of a resonance, an echo of these developments in court?
Clearly, it reflects that kind of unease, sense of being flustered. In fact, we had your story on The Wire, which we presently pointed out, and you joined the dots on these various comments. I think the rush with which the Karnataka governor also has returned the bill quickly to the president suggests that they suddenly, a government that always spoke about being in majority, will of the people, is now conscious of being watched. And a lot of people may say that this is also the result of having 240 seats. See, earlier with 303 parliamentary seats, you could still argue, and to a large extent, it shut up the opposition on that. But now you're a minority party which is leading a coalition government, and thou shalt be treated like all coalition governments have been treated. You have to answer for your actions. You have to answer on the validity, the fairness, and the constitutionality of what you do. So I think Dhankar's kind of unease, or what Tushar Mehta also said, completely out of line for the SG to speak to Supreme Court judges and ask if they are able to say these things because, they're not Muslim. I don't think that they were expecting a basic question of fairness to be raised. That will you do to the goose what you're doing to the gander? That will you allow non-Hindus to sit on temple boards? Because that's a very common sense question which media is not asking. None of the mainstream narratives are putting that into perspective. So if you see how media is covering this, it's all about thank God for the new Waqf Bill amendment, because now the Waqfs cannot stop the Prime Minister's plane from taking off. That is the extent of disinformation that has been spread, rather than asking common sense questions. So I think with the Supreme Court suddenly bursting that kind of bubble, that troll misinformation sphere, which unfortunately constitutes the meta narrative, he just was maybe just nonplussed and asked that, and then follows Mr. Dhankar, as he says, that almost kind of on cue to say the most outrageous things, hoping maybe that the judiciary gets a message, or you have a chilling effect of it being seen as the government's voice. So the government doesn't say anything, but is seen to be somebody who's on the side of the government, is seen to be saying that, and scares all judges, because when Supreme Courts act like that, then lower judiciary, high courts, when it comes to bails, what would happen? What would the government do if Umar Khalid got bail, for instance, as a result of this? Or the IT rules finally got stayed. So you see, these things have a lot of unintended consequences. So it is to arrest that and wrest back control on the narrative that I think Dhankar is coming out with these statements, with even Tushar Mehta saying this, trying to maybe just communalize it and make it trivial. Whereas that's not the point at all. And I'm glad that the Chief Justice of India, who will soon cease to be Chief Justice of India, but came out and said that. So I think that's like a good sign if the judiciary is doing all this and pushing back on core issues which need questions, which need probity, which the media unfortunately is not being able to provide.
Just to remind our viewers what happened in court yesterday after these comments that took place between the CJI and SG Tushar Mehta on whether the bench can hear such a case, and the Chief Justice saying that when they are sitting on the bench they are secular. So after that, on Thursday, the court has given time to the union government for about 7 days to file a reply, and in the meantime, 3 very key provisions of this contentious legislation, which includes the appointment of non-Muslims in central Waqf and state Waqf boards, as well as denotifying existing Waqf by user. These 2 provisions, and along with another one, Sanjay, remind me, I've forgotten the third one, which is the non-Muslims one. And so these 3 provisions were halted in a sense for the next 7 days till the Supreme Court hears the case again. But the question is that we've seen the Minority Affairs Minister, Kiran Rijiju, he's saying that courts do have the right to examine whether the constitutionality, but it cannot be so that the law will not be implemented. So with regard to other chief ministers saying that, that we will not be implementing this law. So what is the future of this legislation if the court, for instance, stays certain parts of this legislation and the government wants to go ahead with it as it is? Can it do so because it is still in the concurrent list?
Which government? See, let's put it this way. If the court stays any legislation, it is as if that legislation doesn't exist till that stay is there. And stays are interim orders till the final hearing. So we do not know what course that the court will take on the 5th of May, and I would not want to go into that territory. But it cannot be that any court order is disobeyed by any government. So if there is a stay, then it can't be implemented. If there is no stay, administratively, that's all that a state government can do. It may not cooperate, it may not be able to get its collectors to immediately issue notifications or take over any disputed land and things like that. But on the contrary, other chief ministers may say, oh, there's no stay and I can go and take over this one. This Waqf doesn't have papers. Various things can happen. But I do think that there will be clear orders we can't have anarchy.
Yeah, and I think this collector thing is a third point
Yes,
that which
in
the
the
court
collector.
has done. So they made it quite clear that there are these three things which are causing grave concern, whose constitutionality is deep in question, so that cannot be done. So I don't think Sanjay can comment much on this, but from what we understand, because there's a formal stay, they cannot go through with it.
There is a statement now by the government that we will not
They have committed to that in court
for the next 7 days.
Had the court just made hostile observations, if you like, and left it at that, then the government would have been free to do what it pleases, to go in accordance with the law that it has enacted. But now there's a very clear law.
What's interesting because of these three observations is that I don't know if you have seen a certain hashtag yesterday was trending, which was Sharia Court of India, kind of feeding into the earlier discussion that we were having.
Yeah, this has happened earlier as well with Justice Chandrachud. He's been trolled extensively on these grounds, and otherwise also individual judges are often trolled. I'm sure the hijab case as well, which again, unfortunately or fortunately, Sanjay Hegde was arguing on that. But judges have got kind of hooted and heard at, and judges have been quite incensed. Some of them, some wiser ones have been unmindful of it. But there's all kinds of bid to exercise pressure, and I think this is like an unofficial troll army of the ruling party, which chimes with whatever they're saying. They're party personnel, some of them loose party personnel, and a lot of them just eggheads. Literally egg-shaped people with no names. So, they kind of let loose this bunch of people who kind of go about threatening and intimidating judges and thinking that they will get scared into not doing things that are deemed unpopular.
On a slightly different note, you see, in the Calcutta High Court, once in an excise matter, classification between skin and height, the judge asked, Mr. Lawyer, what's the difference? So the lawyer looked at him and said, my lord, when I entered the profession, I had skin. Now I have height. So now with this trolling and all these kind of hashtags and this and that, I do think that the judiciary has developed a sufficiently a good height, but please do not take it for granted. If there is proof of an organized army, then you might very well be treading contempt. So I don't know what tips it over, but whoever does this trolling does so at his or her own risk. I would not be wanting to do it.
All right, so before we wrap up, I also want to talk about an interesting development earlier this week is that the BJP is going all out, guns blazing against the Congress because the Enforcement Directorate has filed a charge sheet in the National Herald case against Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi, and both have been named as accused number 1 and accused number 2 in the case. And the case is scheduled for hearing on April 25th. And just to tell our viewers that the ED has invoked sections 44 and 45 of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and basically the charge is that they have been accused of money laundering. The BJP is saying that the Congress has used the AJL and National Herald for money laundering purposes and moved properties to Young India, which is a not-for-profit set up by the Congress. Now, the Congress, on the other hand, claims that Young India and AJL all are very much part of the Congress itself, and Young India is a Section 8 company under the company law, so it is not doing any profits or giving any salaries or perks, but the BJP claims that it has acquired property from AJL. Seema, how do you see this whole thing? The Congress, of course, saying that this is political vendetta, but how do you see the resurgence of the National Herald case, which keeps coming back every few years?
Yeah, it does. And like 13 years down or 12 years down after that, there's been no movement. It has stalled in the court several years because of several infirmities in the prosecution's case. They've been unable to get their act together. As far as the PMLA or the Prevention of Money Laundering Act is concerned, its own constitutionality, while held up by somebody who was then nominated as the Lokpal in some very eye-popping kind of things that were done just before his retirement, remains a very grey area of what constitutes a money laundering. There are no proceeds here, there is no crime. So I think the grounds for the charge sheet, which have been pointed out and which we've been told about, is quite kind of, I don't think there's a great case for it. There's also tremendous coincidence that when the Congress gets into gear, goes off to Gujarat to hold its, AICC and All India Congress Committee meeting there for the first time in 64 years, then starts talking about how it's going to restructure the party, comes up with an Ahmedabad declaration. This follows soon after. And in fact, I want to raise something which may seem kind of out of the syllabus. You know, when you call up someone now, you get a message saying, ki, Savdhan, be careful. You know, if somebody says you're ED, you're a income tax officer, you're this, that, and the other, do not get fooled, etc. People are getting fooled. And it is not to say that people are fools. People are nuts. A lot of these people who are getting victimized and are losing money are very literate people. It's because that the government should think about it, because this is some kind of a straw poll of the government's reputation, that people think that ED officers, IT officials will be up to all this. So people who know better than that are not getting fooled but are thinking this is true. So I think that just speaks
Just
for...
to add there.
Yeah.
I've met very serious people, good writers and all that, who believed that they were under digital arrest.
Yes, because they think this government's, its officers can do that. And it's a tremendous, I think it's a slap on the face of this government's reputation. If people think your highest investigative agencies can dress up in these strange uniforms and do this, because they're reading it all the time. In fact, there's an absurd news item from somebody in Bangalore said, I bought a 50 crore worth dog, a very impressive dog, but the ED lands up there. ED turned up to, they're checking his books now. He was obviously lying. It's not a 50 crore ka kutta. But, I think it's like completely absurd. Is that what the ED is kind of doing in this country right now? At a time of grave economic slump, there are so many things that need addressal. But is this what the ED is about? So, when Congress officials call it the election department of the BJP, then, things like, what is the conviction rate of cases that go up? There's an investigative report by Indian Express which says it's something like 2% or 4%. 96% of the cases filed in the past 10 years are against political opponents. Somebody as small, if you like, quote unquote, or who just done some tambogiri, some fixing of pandals for the Uddhav Thackeray Shiv Sena, gets an ED call. Stuff happens in the cement industry, and then things change in the cement industry. Ownership changes. What's going on? So people seem to be like catching on to this, and people don't have to be as learned as Sanjay here, or who know the law very well, to know that something's amiss, partner. Something's not quite in place.
No, they think that the ED can arrest anybody, and to avoid that, they can do anything. So this digital arrest case I was telling you about, the fellow was told to liquidate all his mutual funds, put it in a particular account, and then send the link. It was almost at that stage. He got in touch with me, and I said, there's nothing called a digital arrest.
And these are literate people who can do all those internet operations. These are not like some seniors who just lost it on the net.
And sometimes, there's a strange place called Jamtara, somewhere in Jharkhand, where all these activities emanate from, and they are the young of India who may not have had a good education, but who are tech savvy.
No, it's a demographic disaster.
We have such talent, but we have a system which cannot use that talent in a legal form.
No, and we have a system where the Prime Minister, not cognizant of what is happening in India in 10 years, of leading to a big disaster, your demographic dividend turns disaster, advises people to talo pakoras, etc. Those who don't get jobs as frying pakoras, then will do jamtara, right? And you've built a political environment where people buy this, that this is probably happening, and it's possible that I'm being digitally arrested. So let me just kind of, play along.
Yeah, so I think this is a 2P government. You have only two options: pakoda or puncture.
Yeah, that's another thing, Shasi. I don't know what you thought about the slur that was passed on by the Prime Minister, but surely it wasn't just a spontaneous slur, was it, Sanjay?
Well, let's put it this way: people who speak often think about what they are speaking, and every word is measured, shaped. It's not something which is
And we saw that before the Lok Sabha elections as well, as every word was measured, shaped. You had Mujra being invoked, you had Mangalsutra snatching, you had buffalo snatching, you had Toti, Nalka Toti snatches being. So I think it's actually got a grim moment, which thanks to their ability to build a discourse around it, doesn't get noticed. But it's quite sad that this is the state of the world's largest democracy and out of the most populous country in the world.
Just to tell our viewers that this is, of course, in reference to what Modi said earlier in this week when he was speaking about the Waqf Amendment Bill, he said he attacked the Congress once again and said that the reason the Waqf Bill was not passed earlier, amendments were not made to the Waqf Act as it was in existence till 2013, was because Muslims were reduced to being fixing cycle punctures. Now, this is of course a slur that he has used in the past as well. In 2002, Seema, as you had pointed out earlier.
In addition to several slurs that have been used, hum 25, hum
Panch-
panch, hamare 25, various things about the camps
Kutte
during
ka
the
pilla.
Gujarat violence, being baby producing factories, and in an interview saying himself that if somebody runs over a small puppy on the road, a kutte ka pilla, then you do feel sad, but you kind of move the car along.
So even when the Waqf Act has already been passed, it is facing challenges in the Supreme Court, and all these developments are happening. The communal fire, in a sense, is continuing to rage, and we know that has had devastating consequences, especially in West Bengal, where violence has continued. People have lost their lives. But before we wrap up, finally, I want to ask you that this ED case against the Congress and what the BJP claims is money laundering. Is it actually money laundering as it claims? Or is it what the Congress is saying, that we have a company, we have paid off the loan of that company through another one of our companies, which is justifiable under the Company Act, but the BJP continues to every day. I think we're seeing a couple of press conferences at least from the BJP. So how do you see this whole development in the backdrop of all this happening?
See, listen, our problem is that the Money Laundering Act is very broad. It was originally meant only for arms money and drugs money. So the proceeds of those crimes should not be in the hands of criminals. You know where money laundering comes from? When the mafia in the US was breaking the prohibition laws, they had to show a source for their money. So they started laundries, saying we got
I
cash.
didn't know this, Okay.
So we got cash income from the laundries. And that's how the phrase money laundering happened. So when you actually have money coming in, and then you legitimize it, that's money laundering. But we have a very broad act and everything. If you beat your wife, also possibly the Money Laundering Act can come in. That's how broad we've made it. Now, a money laundering prosecution cannot succeed unless the underlying prosecution for the predicate offense succeeds. If you are convicted of the basic offense, only then the money laundering offense can also be proved later. So that's why you have that very small conviction rate. But nevertheless, both cases go on parallelly. But the crucial difference is that in a money laundering case, if you get arrested, it is damnably difficult to get bail. So we've seen that with Kejriwal and the entire Aam Aadmi people. So there has been no conviction in the predicate offense. There is no conviction, obviously, in the ED case either. But in the meanwhile, you've kept him out of politics, and then you've managed to break his image, and then finally, possibly one day you may even break his party. So this is exactly what has happened now with regard to the Congress. They've said that okay, this sword also has been taken out to be shown. When we wield it, it is up to us.
And we must remember that the Enforcement Directorate is a wing of the Finance Ministry. It reports to Nirmala Sitharaman. So even CBI, the ostensible autonomy it has, it doesn't have. It's a government wing. So good luck.
All right, so we'll have to keep our eyes on these developments. The case, of course, in the ED case is coming up on April 25th, and we'll see how that develops. Thank you so much, Seema and Sanjay, for joining us. And thank you to our viewers for watching. I'll see you next week.